Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question to the Premier. This morning, the Premier released her long-term energy plan. But the people of Ontario don't need a fancy report to know what the Premier and her Liberal government are planning for their hydro bills. We already know. They're going to skyrocket. The plan confirms it in black and white. 10 years from now, people will be paying 42% more every single month just to keep the lights on. The Premier's $40 billion borrowing scheme has seen to that. Even when households use less power, her long-term energy plans say they'll pay still more. Can the Premier tell us why she's sticking to her $40 billion borrowing scheme when her own long-term energy plan tells us that Ontarians will pay more because of it?
Thank you, Premier. Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to talk about the long-term energy plan, the 25% reduction that people are getting now, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to see costs coming out of the system to lower that for our families and for our businesses even more, Mr. Speaker. I know the third party continues to make their numbers up, Mr. Speaker, and elevate what they're seeing as borrowing plans. They know that those numbers are actually a lot lower than that, Mr. Speaker. It shows it directly in the long-term energy plan. But let's talk about some of the facts that this long-term energy plan is doing, Mr. Speaker. We're making sure that we're bringing forward lower costs for all businesses, for all families, for all farms in this province, for that matter. That's being done through the Fair Hydro Plan. We've already pulled costs out of the system, not having to build new nukes, Mr. Speaker, not having to bring forward large renewable procurement, the second round of it, and renegotiating the Samsung contract are just 3 examples that we can use of how we've taken costs out of the system. I'm looking forward to talking about market renewal in the supplementary.
Thank you. Good. Supplementary.
Again to the Premier, Speaker. Hydro rates have gone up 300% under the Liberals. They've gone up 50% under this Premier's watch alone. And now we know that in the next 10 years, people's bills will go from an already high average $127 a month to an outrageous $181 per month. The Premier's first 2 energy plans had no mention of her plan to sell off Hydro One, a disastrous decision. And this long-term plan is nothing more than a political document that sugarcoats more bad news for Ontario ratepayers. The Premier didn't tell us she'd privatize Hydro One. People said no to privatization, and she did it anyway. She let us down. What makes the Premier think that the people of Ontario give her any credibility on this file?
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that this Premier has done is brought rates down, Mr. Speaker. Brought them down by 25%. Unlike, Mr. Speaker, what that party would propose to do, which is to nationalize Hydro One, spend tens of billions of dollars doing so, Mr. Speaker, and not saving a single penny on anyone's bills. You want to talk about Hydro One, Mr. Speaker? Let's talk about the money that we've used, that we've been able to take and build infrastructure with, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the broadening of the ownership of Hydro One. $13.5 billion in the GTHA GO Regional Rail Express. That's increasing transit, Mr. Speaker. I always thought the NDP supported more transit. I guess they don't, Mr. Speaker. $5.3 billion in the Eglinton Crosstown LRT. Tripling the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund to $300 million, $1.4 billion in the Huron-Ontario LRT in Mississauga and Grafton, $1 billion in Ottawa's LRT. Of course, the broadening and the expansion of Highway 69, Mr. Speaker, making sure that Northern Ontario sees its access to this fund.
Thank you. Final supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. Again to the Premier. Hydro bills have skyrocketed under this Premier, and nothing in her long-term energy plan is going to change that. The people of Ontario don't need to hear any more about stretch goals from the Liberal government. Right now, families are being forced to choose between paying their hydro bills and paying for their groceries. And all the Premier seems to care about is spending an extra $4 billion on an accounting trick to hide the impact of her $40 billion borrowing scheme. I guess we all have our priorities, Speaker. Why is the Premier's priority her re-election and not the people of this province?
Thank you. Be seated, please. Be seated, please. Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Fair Hydro Plan took into consideration every single person in this province and brought forward relief for them, unlike their so-called pie-in-the-sky plan, Mr. Speaker, that didn't even include talking about reductions for First Nations or talking about low-income individuals. Let's look at page 23 of the long-term energy plan, where it talks about distribution rate protection. The RRP program lowers the distribution rates paid by rural and remote customers who face higher distribution costs compared to other areas. Mr. Speaker, that's a 40 to 50% reduction for people that live in the rural and northern parts of our province. Again, something that they didn't even address, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to a party that's actually bringing something for the people of Ontario, it's this government, not the two opposition parties, that one doesn't have a plan, one goes along. We're actually bringing forward real relief for all Ontarians, Mr. Speaker.